I want you to know that I've carried this weight for 8 months now, and the silence has become unbearable. My name is Thomas Mitchell, and I'm 34 years old. I'm a wildlife photographer from Detroit who thought he understood nature, who thought he knew what lurked in the deep woods of the Great Lakes region. I was wrong about everything. It started in March of last year. I'd been living alone in a cabin near the Hiawatha National Forest for almost 6 months, documenting the return of wolves to the area. The isolation was exactly what I needed after my divorce, after losing my job at the newspaper, after watching my life crumble piece by piece in the city. The cabin was primitive, no electricity, no running water, just me, my cameras, and the endless expanse of snow-covered wilderness that stretched beyond the windows. My days followed a simple rhythm. I'd wake before dawn, check my trail cameras, photograph tracks in the snow, and spend hours sitting perfectly still in hunting blinds, waiting for wildlife to emerge. The silence was profound, almost religious. Sometimes I'd go days without hearing another human voice, and I found peace in that solitude that I'd never experienced in the chaos of urban life. The forest in winter was a living cathedral. Ancient pines stretched toward grey skies, their branches heavy with snow that fell in whispered conversations when the wind moved through them. Frozen streams created highways for deer and smaller creatures, their tracks telling stories I was learning to read like scripture. I'd photograph wolf prints in the morning frost, follow them for miles, and feel connected to something primal and honest that civilization had stripped away from me. I'd been documenting a particular pack for weeks, 5 wolves that denned somewhere deeper in the forest than I'd yet explored. Their tracks led north, always north, toward a section of the woods that my topographical map showed as largely uncharted. The old-growth forest up there was so dense that satellite imagery revealed only an endless canopy, like a green ocean hiding its depths. It was on a Tuesday morning in late March that I first saw him. I was following fresh wolf tracks along a frozen creek bed, my breath creating small clouds in the bitter air when movement caught my eye through the trees. At first, I thought it was another photographer or maybe a lost hiker, but as the figure came closer, I realized this was someone who belonged to these woods in a way I never would. He was an elderly native man, probably in his 70s, with silver hair braided down his back and wearing traditional clothes that looked handmade, beaded leather, fur-lined boots, and a heavy wool coat that had seen many winters. But what struck me most was how he moved through the forest. Where I stumbled and broke branches and left a trail of disturbed snow, he seemed to glide between the trees like he was part of the landscape itself. He approached me without fear or surprise, as if he'd been expecting our meeting. His dark eyes studied me with an intensity that was both welcoming and deeply serious. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades spent in these woods. "You're the one with the cameras," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm Joseph Whitehawk. My people have been guardians of this forest for longer than your maps have existed." I introduced myself, feeling suddenly foolish with my expensive equipment and city-soft hands. Joseph nodded thoughtfully, then gestured toward the wolf tracks I'd been following. "They're leading you somewhere specific," he said. "The pack knows you're here, knows you're watching. They're not afraid of you because you move with respect, but where they're going—" He paused, studying my face carefully. "Where they're going is not a place for cameras." Something in his tone made my skin prickle. I'd encountered plenty of locals who were protective of their hunting grounds or sacred sites, and I respected that. But this felt different. Joseph wasn't just warning me away from trespassing. There was genuine concern in his weathered features, like he was trying to protect me from something I couldn't understand. "I don't want to intrude on anything sacred," I told him honestly. "I'm just documenting their behavior patterns." Joseph was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between me and the tracks that led deeper into the uncharted forest. The wind picked up, causing the branches above us to creak and sigh, like the forest itself was participating in our conversation. "There are places in these woods that your people have forgotten," he said finally, "places where the old agreements still hold. The wolves go there because they remember what we've forgotten. They remember what shares the forest with them." The way he said "shares" made my blood run cold, though I couldn't explain why. I'd been in wilderness areas all over the country, and while I respected the power of nature, I'd never been one for supernatural thinking. But standing there in that ancient forest, listening to Joseph speak with such certainty about things unseen, I felt my skepticism wavering. "What kind of agreements?" I asked. Joseph studied me for another long moment, then seemed to reach some internal decision. "Walk with me," he said. "There are things you need to understand about this place before you go deeper." We spent the rest of that day together, and I learned more about the forest in those few hours than I had in months of solitary observation. Joseph showed me how to read sign that I'd been missing, scratches on tree bark that weren't made by bears, strange geometric patterns in clearings that weren't random, areas where no birds nested despite abundant food sources. My grandfather was the last keeper of the old stories. Joseph told me as we walked. He died when I was 22, and I thought the stories would die with him, but the forest itself keeps teaching for those willing to listen. As the afternoon wore on, Joseph led me to places in the woods I never would have found on my own. Hidden springs that stayed unfrozen even in the deepest winter. Circles of ancient oaks that grew in patterns that seemed too perfect to be natural. Caves with paintings on the walls that he said were older than any recorded history of the region. "The wolves aren't the only old residents here," he told me, as we stood in one such cave, our flashlights illuminating red ochre handprints and strange symbols I didn't recognize. "This place has been a threshold for a very long time, a place where different kinds of existence touch each other." I photographed the cave paintings, but when I developed the film later, the images were distorted, as if something had interfered with the light itself. Joseph wasn't surprised when I told him. "Some things resist being captured," he said simply. That night, back at my cabin, I found myself unable to focus on editing my photographs or updating my field notes. Joseph's words echoed in my mind, and I kept thinking about the way the forest had felt different after our conversation, more alive, more aware, like it was watching me with intelligent eyes. I'd come to these woods seeking solitude and simplicity, but I was beginning to understand that I'd stumbled into something far more complex than I'd bargained for. The wolves I'd been following weren't just predators moving through their territory. They were part of an ancient ecosystem that included elements I was only starting to glimpse. Over the next few days, I found myself hoping I'd encounter Joseph again. I had so many questions about the stories he'd mentioned, about the old agreements and the other residents of the forest, but the woods seemed empty of human presence, and I began to wonder if our meeting had been as chance as it had seemed. The wolf pack continued to move north, their tracks leading deeper into the uncharted sections of the forest. I followed at a respectful distance, documenting their behavior while thinking about Joseph's warnings. My photographs during this period show a subtle change in the forest itself. Shadows that fell at strange angles, trees that seemed to lean toward the camera, clearings where the snow had melted in patterns that defied the weather patterns I'd been observing. It was a week after meeting Joseph that I discovered the feeding site. The wolves had been visiting it regularly, and I'd assumed it was a fresh kill. But when I finally got close enough to investigate, I found something that challenged everything I thought I knew about predator behavior. The site was a small clearing surrounded by massive pine trees, their trunks scarred with marks I now recognized as the strange scratches Joseph had shown me. In the center of the clearing was what appeared to be an offering, not a kill, but carefully arranged portions of meat and organs that had been placed there deliberately. The wolves weren't hunting here, they were receiving. I set up my camera at a distance and waited. As dusk fell, the pack arrived as expected, but they didn't approach the offering immediately. Instead, they sat in a perfect circle around the clearing, their eyes fixed on the tree line opposite from where I was hidden. That's when I saw it emerge from the shadows. At first, my mind tried to categorize what I was seeing as just another forest creature. Perhaps a bear, though the proportions seemed wrong. Maybe an elk, though the movement was unlike anything I'd ever observed. But as the figure stepped fully into the clearing, I realized I was looking at something that existed outside my understanding of the natural world. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, with limbs that were elongated beyond human proportions, but moved with deliberate intelligence. Its skin was the color of winter bark, mottled gray and brown, and seemed to shift and change in the flickering shadows of the fire. But it was the eyes that paralyzed me. Ancient, intelligent, and filled with a hunger that went far beyond physical need. The creature moved with purpose, acknowledging the wolves with what appeared to be respectful nods before approaching the offering. As it fed, I noticed that the wolves remained perfectly still, like they were participating in a ceremony rather than simply waiting their turn. My hands trembling, I raised my camera and took a series of photographs. Through the viewfinder, I watched the creature pause in its feeding and turn to look directly at me, though I was hidden more than 100 yards away and downwind. Those ancient eyes met mine through the camera lens, and I felt a jolt of recognition that went deeper than sight. The creature, and I knew somehow that calling it merely a creature was inadequate, stood slowly and began walking toward my hiding place. The wolves followed, not aggressively but with the same ceremonial purpose they'd shown during the feeding. Every instinct I possessed told me to run, but I found myself frozen in place, partly from fear but partly from a strange sense that running would somehow violate the rules of whatever was happening. As the being approached, I could hear it breathing, slow and deliberate, and smell something like pine sap and old snow, and something else, something organic and wild, that spoke to parts of my brain that civilization had tried to suppress. When it was close enough that I could see the texture of its skin and the way starlight reflected in its eyes, it spoke. The voice was like wind through hollow trees, words formed by vocal cords that weren't quite human, but carried meaning that bypassed my rational mind and went straight to my understanding. "You see me," it said. Not a question, but an acknowledgement of fact. I managed to nod, though my entire body was shaking now. "The old man prepared you," it continued. "Good. There are things you need to understand about your species, about the choices you face." The wolves had arranged themselves in a circle around us, and I realized I was no longer afraid. There was something about the creature's presence that, while overwhelming, didn't feel threatening. It felt like being in the presence of something immensely powerful that had chosen to restrain itself, like standing next to a river that could sweep you away, but had decided to let you cross safely. "My people have names for me in many languages," the being continued. "Wendigo, in the language of Joseph's ancestors. But names are just sounds. What I am is much older than names, older than your species' memory of these forests." It gestured to the trees around us, and I realized that what I'd taken for shadows were actually more figures, tall and pale, and moving with the same deliberate grace. The forest, I understood suddenly, was far more populated than I'd ever imagined. "We are the old residents," the being explained. "We were here when the ice came, and when it left. We were here when your species was learning to use fire, and we'll be here when you've forgotten how to make it." The words should have been terrifying, but they weren't. They were simply facts, stated without malice or judgment. I found my voice enough to ask, "What do you want from me?" The being's expression shifted, and I realized it was something like sadness. "Not from you," it said. "For you. Your species stands at a threshold. The choices you make in the coming years will determine whether you join the community of the forest or whether you remain forever outside it." One of the other figures approached, carrying something in its elongated hands. When it offered the object to me, I saw it was a piece of bone carved with symbols similar to those I'd seen in the cave paintings. The bone was warm to the touch despite the freezing air, and when my fingers closed around it, I felt a jolt of connection to everything around me. The trees, the wolves, the snow, the beings watching me with their ancient eyes. "You document the visible world," the first being said. "But the visible is just the surface. Beneath it is a network of relationship and reciprocity that your people have forgotten. The wolves remember, the trees remember, we remember." Images flashed through my mind, not my own memories, but something older and deeper. I saw the forest as it had been centuries ago, when native peoples moved through it as part of the ecosystem rather than as conquerors of it. I saw the first European settlements, the gradual cutting and clearing, the slow erasure of the old agreements that had kept different forms of life in balance. But I also saw possibilities, futures where humanity remembered how to be part of the web rather than apart from it. Futures where the old residents emerged from hiding and shared their knowledge with people who were ready to listen. "The choice is coming," the being said. "Your people will decide whether to continue down the path of separation or whether to remember what you once knew about being part of the living world." "What can I do?" I asked, though I wasn't sure where the question came from. "Bear witness," it replied simply. "Tell the stories that need telling. Help others remember what they've forgotten." The carved bone in my hand grew warmer, and suddenly I could sense the entire forest around us, every tree, every sleeping creature, every stream flowing beneath the snow. The sensation was overwhelming, but not unpleasant, like suddenly being able to hear a symphony you'd only caught fragments of before. "The wolves brought you here because they recognized something in you," the being continued. "A willingness to see beyond the surface. But seeing is only the beginning. Understanding requires relationship." It gestured to the other figures, and they began to move closer. As they did, I realized each one was slightly different. Some taller, some with different colorations, some with features that suggested they belonged to different families or clans. Despite their alien appearance, there was something unmistakably familial about the way they interacted, protective and caring, in ways that reminded me of the wolf pack. "We are not the monsters your stories have made us," one of the others said, its voice like water over stones. "We are the memory of what your species could become if you choose relationship over domination." The first being nodded. "The hunger you fear in us is not for flesh, but for connection. We hunger for the return of reciprocity, for the healing of the broken agreements between your people and the rest of the living world." As if to demonstrate, it knelt down and placed its hands on the snow-covered ground. Where its fingers touched, I could see tiny shoots of green pushing through the frozen earth. Not unseasonable growth, but something more fundamental, like the being was connected directly to the life force that moved through all growing things. "We can teach," it said, looking up at me, "but only to those who approach with respect rather than fear, with willingness to receive rather than to take." The wolves had been silent throughout our exchange, but now one of them, the alpha female I'd been photographing for weeks, approached and nuzzled against my leg. Her contact felt like a blessing, an acceptance into something I was only beginning to understand. "She knows you're ready for the next part," the being said, standing slowly. "The place where the oldest agreements were made, where the choices for the future will be decided." Before I could ask what it meant, the entire group, the beings, the wolves, even the shadows themselves, began moving deeper into the forest. I followed without hesitation, the carved bones still warm in my palm, my camera forgotten in favor of simply witnessing whatever was about to unfold. We walked for what felt like hours through parts of the forest that couldn't exist on any map. The trees grew larger and older as we progressed, their trunks massive beyond anything I'd seen in old-growth preserves. The air itself felt different, thicker, more alive, charged with an energy that made every breath feel significant. Eventually, we emerged into a clearing unlike anything I could have imagined. It was perfectly circular, perhaps 100 yards across, surrounded by trees so ancient they seemed more like pillars holding up the sky than living organisms. In the center of the clearing was a structure that defied easy description, part natural formation, part deliberate construction, like a council chamber carved from living rock and growing wood. "The heart place," the first being said simply, "where all the threads come together." As we approached the structure, I could see that its walls were covered with markings, not just the symbols I'd seen in the cave, but layer upon layer of different writing systems, different artistic traditions, all somehow integrated into a coherent whole. Some of the markings seemed to glow with their own light, while others appeared to shift and change as I watched. "Every species that has achieved consciousness has left its mark here," the being explained. "Your ancestors too, before they forgot the way." Inside the structure, the walls opened up into a vast space that seemed larger than the exterior dimensions could contain. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above, but the walls were filled with what I can only describe as a living library, not books or scrolls, but something more direct, more immediate. Touching certain sections of the wall brought flashes of memory, understanding, connection to knowledge that belonged to the entire community of consciousness, rather than to any single individual. The beings arranged themselves in a circle around a depression in the center of the chamber. As they did, the wolves took positions between them, and I realized I was witnessing something that had been happening for millennia, a council, a gathering, a meeting of minds that transcended species boundaries. "Show him," the first being said to one of the others. The second being approached one of the glowing sections of wall and placed its hand against the markings. Suddenly, the entire chamber filled with images, not projected onto surfaces, but somehow present in the air itself, three-dimensional and more real than reality. I saw the history of consciousness on Earth, not just human consciousness, but the awareness that emerged in dolphins, in elephants, in the great old trees, in beings like the ones surrounding me. I saw how these different forms of awareness had learned to communicate with each other, to share knowledge and wisdom across the boundaries of physical form. But I also saw where humanity had begun to diverge from this community of minds. The development of agriculture, the growth of cities, the gradual belief that consciousness was something that belonged only to humans, and that the rest of the natural world was mere resource to be exploited. The separation was not inevitable, the first being explained, as the images continued to flow around us. It was a choice, made gradually over many generations, but choices can be unmade, new choices can be made. The images shifted, showing possible futures branching out like the tributaries of a great river. In some, humanity continued down the path of separation, eventually destroying the conditions that allowed consciousness to flourish on Earth. In others, humanity rediscovered its place in the web of awareness, adding its unique gifts to the greater symphony while learning from the wisdom of other forms of consciousness. "The choice point is approaching," the being continued, Your species is developing technologies that could either deepen the separation or facilitate new forms of connection. The outcome depends on whether humans remember their place in the community of consciousness or continue to believe they exist apart from it. I watched, mesmerized, as the images showed possible technologies that could allow direct communication between species, between human minds and the intelligence present in forests and oceans, between individual consciousness and the greater awareness that flowed through all living systems. But I also saw how the same technologies could be used to further separate humans from the natural world, to create entirely artificial environments where the old connections could be completely forgotten. "What role do I play in this?" I asked, though part of me was afraid of the answer. "You are a bridge builder," the first being replied. "Your work documenting the visible world has prepared you to document the invisible one. But more than that, your willingness to relationship, to genuine encounter, makes you a translator between worlds." One of the other beings approached, carrying what appeared to be a small, crystalline structure that pulsed with soft light. When it placed the crystal in my free hand, I felt another jolt of connection. But this time, it wasn't just to the immediate environment. It was to a network of consciousness that stretched across continents and decades, connecting me to other humans who had made similar choices, who had accepted similar responsibilities. "You are not alone in this work," the being said. "There are others in many places who have accepted the role of bridge builder. The network is growing." Through the crystal, I could sense these other connections. A marine biologist in Hawaii who had learned to communicate directly with whales. A forestry researcher in the Amazon who worked with tree consciousness. A physicist in Europe who was developing technologies for trans-species communication. All of them connected by the same fundamental choice to approach the natural world as community rather than resource. "The old agreements are being renewed," the first being explained, "but they require human participation. Your species cannot be excluded from the community of consciousness. You are too powerful, too influential, but you must choose participation over domination, relationship over exploitation." The images around us shifted again, showing what the renewed agreements might look like. Cities designed in collaboration with forest consciousness, agriculture that enhanced rather than depleted soil communities, technologies that amplified natural intelligence rather than replacing it, human societies that recognized the rights and wisdom of other species and incorporated that recognition into their decision-making processes. "It looks impossible," I said, thinking about the political and economic systems that seemed locked into patterns of environmental destruction. "All change looks impossible until it happens," the being replied. "Your species has changed before, has made collective choices that seemed impossible. The question is whether you will make this choice in time." The wolves began to stir restlessly, and I realized that dawn was approaching. Our time in this place was limited, bound by rhythms and agreements I didn't fully understand. "What do I do with what I've learned here?" I asked. "Live it," the first being said simply. "Let it change how you move through the world. Trust that living the truth of relationship will create opportunities to share that truth with others." The crystal in my hand pulsed brighter, and suddenly I understood that it wasn't just a communication device. It was a responsibility. Through it, I would be able to sense when others were ready for the kind of encounter I'd just experienced. When opportunities for bridge building presented themselves. "The forest will teach you," the being continued. "Return here when you need guidance, when you need renewal. But remember that every place where consciousness touches consciousness is sacred. Every genuine encounter with another form of awareness is a step toward the renewal of the old agreements." And as the beings began to move toward the edges of the chamber, I felt a deep sadness at the thought of losing this connection, but the first being seemed to sense my emotion. "Connection once made cannot be unmade," it said gently. "We will be present every time you choose relationship over separation, every time you listen to the consciousness in a tree or a river or a wild creature. The distance between worlds is much smaller than your people believe." The wolves were already moving toward the entrance to the chamber, and I knew it was time to leave. But as I followed them, I felt transformed in ways I was only beginning to understand. The carved bone and crystal in my hands were warm reminders of realities that existed beyond the surface world. But more important was the change in my own perception. The forest we walked through on our return journey was no longer just a collection of trees and animals. It was a living community of consciousness, a network of awareness that I was now part of. I could sense the communication flowing between the trees, the complex negotiations between predator and prey species, the deep intelligence that governed the entire ecosystem. When we reached the edge of the clearing where my cabin stood, the beings paused. The first one approached me one last time. "Your work documenting wolves led you here," it said. "Now your real work begins. Document the relationships. Show others what you've learned to see." With that, the entire group, beings and wolves alike, melted back into the forest as silently as they had emerged. I stood alone in the pre-dawn darkness, holding the two objects they'd given me and wondering if I'd dreamed the entire experience. But when I returned to my cabin and examined the carved bone and crystal by lamplight, they were undeniably real. And when I checked my camera, I found that somehow, despite my focus on the direct experience, it had continued photographing throughout our journey. The images were unlike anything in my previous work, not just pictures of a forest, but documents of a living community, shadows and light that seemed to pulse with intelligence and purpose. Over the following weeks, I found myself approaching my photography completely differently. Instead of hunting for dramatic shots of individual animals, I began documenting relationships, the way trees communicated through their root systems, the complex negotiations between different species sharing territory, the subtle signs of the deeper intelligence that governed ecosystem dynamics. Joseph appeared at my cabin one morning in early April, unsurprised to find me transformed by my experience in the Heart Place. "You understand now," he said simply, "why the old stories matter, why the agreements must be renewed." We spent hours talking about what I'd experienced, and Joseph helped me understand how to interpret the visions I'd been given. The possible futures I'd seen weren't predetermined, he explained, but they were real potentials that would be actualized based on the choices humans made in the coming decades. "The beings you met are patient," he said. "They've waited centuries for humans to remember their place in the community of consciousness, but they know that time is running out. The ecological systems that support all consciousness on Earth are reaching breaking points." Joseph also helped me understand my role as a bridge builder. It wasn't about convincing people to believe in supernatural encounters, but about helping them rediscover their natural capacity for relationship with the more-than-human world. Every person who learned to truly listen to a tree or genuinely communicate with a wild animal was contributing to the renewal of the old agreements. "Start small," he advised. "Find the people who are already questioning the separation. Show them what you've learned to see." My first opportunity came sooner than I expected. A group of environmental science students from the university visited the area in late April, conducting research on forest regeneration patterns. Their professor, Dr. Sarah Harrison, was a woman in her 50s who approached her scientific work with a rigor and respect that reminded me of Joseph's relationship to the traditional knowledge. During their stay, I shared some of my recent photographs, Not the obviously extraordinary images from the Heart Place, but the relationship-focused work that showed the forest as a living community. Dr. Harrison studied them with intense interest. "These are remarkable," she said. "You're capturing ecosystem dynamics that we usually only see in data. How are you seeing these patterns?" Instead of explaining directly, I offered to guide her and her students to some of the locations where I'd learned to observe differently. Over the course of several days, I introduced them gradually to ways of perceiving the forest that went beyond conventional scientific observation. One morning, while we were observing a complex interaction between a beaver family and a hawk nest, Dr. Harrison suddenly straightened up with a look of recognition. "The trees are mediating," she said quietly. "They're facilitating communication between the beavers and the hawks about territorial boundaries." That was the moment I knew she was ready for deeper conversation. That evening, away from her students, I shared more of my experience, not the encounter with the beings, but the shift in perception that allowed me to recognize the intelligence present in the ecosystem itself. "I've been studying forest ecology for 30 years, she said after a long silence, "and I've always sensed that there was more happening than what our instruments could measure, but I've never had a framework for understanding it." Dr. Harrison became my first real collaborator in the bridge-building work. Through her, I met other scientists who were questioning the assumptions of purely materialistic approaches to studying natural systems. We began developing new methodologies for ecosystem research that incorporated recognition of intelligence and agency in non-human life. The crystal the beings had given me proved to be more than just a communication device. It seemed to enhance my ability to perceive the network of consciousness that connected all living systems. Through it, I began to sense other people who were having similar experiences, who were ready for the kind of transformation I'd undergone. Over the summer, I traveled to other locations, always following the subtle guidance of the crystal and the expanded perception I'd developed. I met a marine biologist in Maine who had learned to communicate with pilot whales, a poet in Montana who wrote verses that seemed to channel the consciousness of the landscape itself, a carpenter in Vermont who built structures that enhanced rather than interrupted the intelligence of the places where they stood. Each of these encounters deepened my understanding of the network the beings had shown me. Humanity's return to the community of consciousness wasn't happening through any organized movement or institution. It was happening through individuals who had made the choice to approach the world as relationship rather than resource. But I also encountered resistance and skepticism that reminded me how challenging this transformation would be. At a photography conference in Chicago, I made the mistake of sharing too much too quickly with an audience that wasn't prepared for such radical departures from conventional thinking. The reception was hostile enough to remind me of Joseph's advice about starting small and finding people who were already questioning the dominant paradigm. By autumn, I had developed a clearer sense of how to share what I'd learned. Instead of talking about supernatural encounters or impossible beings, I focused on teaching people how to observe relationships in nature, how to recognize intelligence in non-human life, how to approach the natural world with respect and genuine curiosity. My photography exhibitions began to include interactive elements, guided observation sessions where visitors learned to see forests and wildlands as living communities rather than scenic backdrops. The response was remarkable. People hungry for deeper connection with the natural world responded intuitively to invitations to perceive it differently. I returned to the Heart Place several times throughout the year, each visit deepening my understanding of the work I'd been given. The beings were always welcoming, always ready to share more knowledge and perspective, but they also made it clear that the real work happened in the everyday world, in the countless small choices to approach life as relationship rather than separation. The transformation your species needs cannot happen through mystical experience alone, the first being explained during one of these visits. It must happen through changed ways of living, working, and relating to the world. During the winter months, I focused on developing what I came to call relationship technologies, methods for recognizing and enhancing communication between human and more than human consciousness. These included photographic techniques for documenting ecosystem intelligence, meditation practices for deepening empathic connection with natural systems, and collaborative approaches to land management that incorporated the perspectives of non-human inhabitants. Working with Dr. Harrison and others, we began pilot projects that demonstrated the practical benefits of approaching ecological systems as communities of intelligence rather than collections of resources. A forestry project in Oregon that consulted with tree consciousness produced healthier forest regeneration than conventional management techniques. An agricultural project in Iowa that worked with soil intelligence produced higher yields with fewer inputs than industrial farming methods. These practical successes helped legitimize the approach for people who might have dismissed it as purely spiritual or mystical. The beings I'd encountered were proving to be right. The renewal of the old agreements could happen through changed practices, not just changed beliefs, but as my work expanded and the network of bridge builders grew, I also became aware of the forces that resisted this transformation. Corporations whose profits depended on treating nature as commodity rather than community. Political systems that were locked into adversarial rather than collaborative approaches to problem-solving. Educational institutions that taught separation rather than relationship as the foundation of human identity. The choice point the beings had described was becoming more visible. Technologies that could facilitate communication between species were being developed, but they were also being used to further manipulate and control natural systems. Climate change and ecological destruction were forcing humanity to confront the consequences of separation, but they were also creating opportunities for even more extreme forms of domination over natural systems. During my final visit to the Heart Place before writing this account, I asked the beings about the timeline for this choice point, about how much time humanity had to change course before the opportunities for renewed relationship were lost. Time is not linear in the way your people understand it, the first being replied. The choice is being made continuously in every encounter between human and more than human consciousness. Each person who chooses relationship over separation moves the outcome toward renewal. Each person who deepens separation moves it toward collapse. This perspective was both reassuring and terrifying. It meant that the future wasn't predetermined, that individual choices really mattered, but it also meant that there was no external authority, no government or institution that could make this choice for humanity as a whole. It had to emerge from the accumulation of countless personal transformations. Your role is not to save the world, the being continued. Your role is to help people remember who they really are, to reconnect with their place in the community of consciousness. The world will save itself if humanity rediscovers its proper relationship to it. As I write this account, 8 months after my first encounter with the beings, I'm constantly amazed by how the work continues to unfold. The network of bridge builders grows daily, connecting people across disciplines and continents who have made similar choices to approach life as relationship rather than resource. My photography has evolved into something I never could have imagined, not just documentation of the visible world, but collaboration with the consciousness present in every landscape. The images that emerge from this collaborative process reveal dimensions of beauty and intelligence that conventional photography cannot access. But more important than any artistic achievement is the growing community of people who are learning to live differently, to work differently, to relate to the world differently. Teachers who are incorporating recognition of natural intelligence into their curricula. Doctors who are learning from the healing wisdom present in living systems. Engineers who are developing technologies that enhance rather than replace natural intelligence. The future the beings showed me is beginning to manifest, one relationship at a time, one choice at a time, one person at a time, remembering their place in the community of consciousness that includes all life on Earth. I still live in the cabin near the Hiawatha National Forest, still document the wolves and their relationships with the deeper residents of these ancient woods. But now I understand that I'm not just an observer of this community, I'm a participant in it, a bridge between different forms of consciousness, a translator between worlds that are much closer together than most humans realize. The carved bone and crystal remain with me always, warm reminders of realities that exist beyond the surface world. But more important are the changes in perception that allow me to recognize the intelligence and awareness that flows through every encounter, every landscape, every moment of authentic relationship with the more than human world. Joseph visits regularly, and we often sit in silence together, listening to the conversations that flow continuously between the trees, the streams, the wind, and all the visible and invisible residents of this place. In those moments, I understand that the work of bridge building is not separate from the work of simply being present, simply participating in the ancient dialogue that connects all forms of consciousness. The choice point continues to approach, moment by moment, decision by decision, but I've learned to trust the process, to trust that the intelligence present in natural systems includes humanity and will guide us home if we remain open to relationship rather than trapped in separation. Sometimes in the early morning hours, when the mist rises from the forest floor and the boundaries between visible and invisible grow thin, I catch glimpses of the beings moving through the trees, tending to their ancient work of maintaining the agreements that keep consciousness alive on this planet. They acknowledge me with gentle nods, and I understand that we are colleagues now, different forms of awareness working toward the same goal of renewal and relationship. This is what they wanted me to share, what they knew would resonate with others who are ready to remember their place in the community of consciousness that includes all life. The story is not mine alone. It belongs to everyone who has felt the call to bridge building, to relationship, to the renewal of the old agreements that can heal the separation between humanity and the rest of the living world. The forest continues to teach, continues to welcome those who approach with respect and genuine curiosity. The beings continue their patient work of guiding consciousness toward relationship rather than separation. And the network of bridge builders continues to grow, one transformed heart at a time, one opened mind at a time, one renewed relationship at a time. The choice is always present, always available, always being made. What the beings showed me about humanity's future is not prophecy, but possibility, not predetermined fate, but potential that becomes reality through the accumulated choices of individuals who dare to live as if relationship, rather than separation, is the foundation of existence.